Hello again, 102. In this part 4 of chapter 19, we are going to talk about Theodore Roosevelt. From the point of view of 2018, there has never been a more controversial president in American political history than TR. You have to understand this man from the get-go. He is a man of the 19th century, and we've been discussing some of the influences on the elites and the highly educated people of those late 19th century years. He is a Harvard grad of 1880. He is right in the middle of these ideas of social Darwinism, and he embraced them wholeheartedly. He is a highly educated person. He wrote many books on many different subjects, and he wanted a political career. He aspired to great leadership positions, and he got into politics and won election to the New York legislature. But tragedy struck him at an early age. His mother died of typhoid fever, another common disease eradicated by 20th century science, and 11 hours later in the same house, his wife Alice died after giving birth to his daughter. And in the aftermath of this, Roosevelt was in deep depression. He sold everything and he moved west, and he was a cattle rancher, cowboy, for a couple of years. And he loved being out in the West. I owe more than I can express to the West, he emphasized in his memoirs. He came back in the late 1880s. He had the misfortune while he was in the Dakotas of some of the worst winters of the 19th century, and his herds got destroyed and he failed as a rancher. So he ended up coming back, and he gets involved in politics once again. These are some of the early positions that he had. He was federal civil service commissioner, and he spent 2 years being a policeman in New York City, where he was involved in trying to clean up the corruption that existed in the police department there. In 1896, he is going to campaign for McKinley, and again, we've already mentioned in a previous video that he is a war hero as a result of the War of 1898 and the exploits that were publicized in the newspapers of the Rough Riders. And he will be rewarded by McKinley, as we mentioned, with the Assistant Secretary of the Navy job, and then he gains the governorship of New York, and by the end of the century, he's the most famous Republican in the country. And this is problematic for some of the conservative Republicans in the party who don't really trust Roosevelt, and there'll be more on that in coming chapters. They don't really think that he is a true conservative, and they were right, he's not. Roosevelt will evolve with the times. In 1900, McKinley will end up having Roosevelt as his running mate at vice president. The Democrats once again will use William Jennings Bryan, the great commoner, and he wanted to make imperialism the paramount issue. They want to condemn what had gone on in the Philippines as an unnecessary war. And the Republicans, as I mentioned, renominated McKinley. And usually, if you become the vice president, that's the end of your political career in American political history. This is a dead-end job, and there were many in the party who had done this on purpose. And McKinley conducts a front porch campaign again. He does not go out. Roosevelt does it for him. He goes out speaking against Bryan's communistic and socialistic doctrines. My, how Roosevelt will change in just a few years from what he is saying now in 1900, promoting higher taxes and the unlimited coinage of silver. And at one stop, Roosevelt claimed that all of Bryan's supporters were lunatics, idiots, knaves, all cowards. I wonder if Roosevelt had been reading Judge magazine, ladies and gentlemen. You recall this? The platform of lunacy of the Populist Party, which Bryan sprang from. And here are the results of the election of 1900. A clear electoral college vote, 2/3 majority. The Green, as usual, solid South, ladies and gentlemen. And some of the farmers and Westerners also support the Democrats. McKinley is elected, and less than a year later, his term ends abruptly and tragically. On September the 6th, 1901, while the president was shaking hands with well-wishers at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, my hometown, a 28-year-old unemployed anarchist named Leon Czolgosz, an angry son of Polish immigrants, approached him with a gun concealed in a bandaged hand, and he fired twice at point-blank range. "I done my duty!" Czolgosz screamed. One bullet was deflected by the president's breastbone, but the other tore through his stomach, and on September 14th, McKinley dies. Now, that alleged dead-end job of the vice presidency, now that damn cowboy, to the chagrin of Mark Hanna, this ends his influence in the Republican Party, because the damn cowboy is the President of the United States. And Roosevelt practices big stick diplomacy. The Colossus of the North will continually, as we saw on maps in a previous video, get involved in the events and problems and issues of the Caribbean. He believes that it is the destiny of the United States to become a great civilized power and impose its will to bring law, order, and righteousness to the backward peoples as he sees them. Again, he is a 19th century man of the world. He gets reelected in 1904, more on that in a moment. He beats the Democrat Alton Parker. And after he gets reelected, the Panama Canal will be a big issue in American foreign policy. And this is a famous picture of Roosevelt visiting the construction site in 1906. It was clear in the aftermath of the War of 1898 that something had to be done to ease travel between the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. By the time the United States West Coast Fleet got to the Caribbean, the war was over. You cut the travel by 8,000 miles if you could cut across the isthmus. And the French were the first to try to dig the canal from 1881 through 87. Ferdinand de Lesseps, the same construction firm that had done the Suez Canal in the Middle East, they attempted the same thing across Central America, but it failed. And this bankrupted France, ladies and gentlemen, and that ends the Republic there. And this treaty, this is one of the last ones. There were actually 4 treaties involved in this whole process in the late 19th century, but this is the one that was negotiated by Secretary of State Hay with the Colombians. And they rejected the $10 million offer. They wanted $25 million. And this outraged President Roosevelt. He called the Colombians foolish and homicidal corruptionists in Bogota, Colombia. And as a consequence, there were factions that wanted to revolt against Colombian rule. And Roosevelt aided the Panamanian rebels. And he sent a battleship into the Caribbean Sea. I think it was the Nashville. And they parked off the coast of what is today Panama and helped them to declare and win independence from Colombia. They agreed to the original treaty that was offered to the Colombians. And for $250,000 a year, the canal zone was rented. And Roosevelt boasted that he took the canal zone while the Congress debated. And while the debate goes on about the legitimacy of his actions, The canal does also. This will take years to build, and it eventually opens on August the 15th, 1914. We can argue about the dubiousness of Roosevelt's actions, but that construction site, ladies and gentlemen, eventually leads to the eradication of yellow fever and malaria, because William Gorgas and George Goethals, two of the Army Corps of Engineer leaders, investigate the problem of that. One of the big reasons why the French efforts failed is that they died from disease. And eventually they're going to discover that the mosquito carries those diseases. They eradicated mosquitoes from the construction zone, and that was a big reason why it succeeded. The corollary is a plank of American foreign policy. We are an international police power in the Western Hemisphere to this day. This is something that we argue about to this day. This is a big part of American foreign policy. And it's been used multiple times, as you see here from this map, in all of these different countries of the Caribbean. Multiple problems, multiple times troops have been dispatched through the 1960s to keep, quote, law and order, unquote, or in the earlier parts of the 20th century to keep European powers from coming in and taking matters into their own hands. In Asia, while conducting big stick diplomacy in Latin America, he's playing the role of peacemaker in East Asia. The Russo-Japanese War erupted in 1904 because the Japanese threatened their ambitions in China and Korea. And the Japanese win this. They destroy the Russian fleet and end up taking possession of the Sakhalin Islands, and they also will occupy Korea, and they'll end up annexing the kingdom in 1910. This is why Koreans and Japanese people do not get along. This was a colony of Japan for many years. And they sent out feelings is not really the correct term. They sent out overtures that they are willing to have a peace conference with the Russians. Roosevelt sponsored it in New Hampshire, and the Treaty of Portsmouth was signed on September the 5th, 1905, that officially ended the Russo-Japanese War. They acknowledged that the Japanese would have control of Korea, and at that time both powers agreed to leave Manchuria, and for a time the Japanese will abide by that. Eventually they're going to roll into Manchuria, rename it Manchukuo. More on that in later chapters. At the same time this was going on, he sends Taft to meet with the foreign minister in Tokyo, and they negotiated the Taft-Katsura Agreement, which sold out the Koreans basically in return for acknowledging U.S. control of the Philippines. And for a while the Japanese will agree to that as well. 3 years later he sends Elihu Root, the new Secretary of State in his administration after he was reelected in 1904, and they negotiate this agreement about what to do with China. And again, for a while the Japanese abide by the terms of this agreement until the militarists take over in the 1920s, and eventually the war in Asia begins in 1931 with the Japanese invasion of mainland China. Both sides really distrust each other. Both sides have similar ideas about the world. And this is going to lead many Americans to think about the Yellow Peril. There's always been racial conflicts on the West Coast. And in 1906, The San Francisco school board wanted people of Asian descent to attend separate public schools, and the Japanese government protested. Roosevelt persuaded the school board to change its policy, but he also sent Root there again to negotiate the gentleman's agreement to stop the Japanese from sending their unemployed to the West Coast, which was happening more and more frequently, which was exacerbating tensions between Californians and the Japanese. And in return, separate schools were eliminated, and they stopped sending so many immigrants to the United States. And this stopped problems for a time. As mentioned, after he was reelected in 1904, he celebrated the rise of America to status as a world power with a great flourish. Later in his term, he sends the whole Navy on a tour around the world. All of the battleships and naval vessels engaged in this great white fleet were literally painted white, and they make ports of call all over the world. Are they going to fight? Is this just a show of strength? It's basically a show of arms, showing the world that the United States is now a military power. And they eventually get back just before the end of his last term. Roosevelt should have ran again instead of allowing Taft to take his place, and he regretted that decision later on. Once the Great White Fleet got back home, they were immediately painted gray again, battleship gray, and this created problems throughout the 19th century. Going back to where this video began, you have a man of the 19th century leading the United States into the modern world with the views and the values of social Darwinism. And this is not the only part of the world that thinks this way. The Japanese also have these ideas. The Germans, the French, the British. Basically, the modern technological world looks down on the countries of Asia and Africa, viewing them as being backward because they're not as technologically advanced. It had nothing to do with their political or economic capabilities. They don't have the technology yet. That is really the only major difference. And that ends this particular part 4.